Good afternoon, and welcome to today's Atlantic Council event, Maximizing the Impact of Special Operations Forces for Future Strategic Challenges. My name is Matthew Kranig, and I'm Vice President and Senior Director of the Atlantic Council's Scowcroft Center for Strategy and Security. The United States and its allies face a dangerous international security environment, with a major war in Europe, conflicts in the Middle East, Chinese aggression against U.S. allies and partners in the Indo-Pacific, and China and Russia will likely remain the United States' main competitors, continuing to destabilize international order while pursuing their objectives through conventional and unconventional means. They're increasingly working together with Iran and North Korea in what some have referred to as an axis of aggressors. As the United States and its allies confront this dangerous environment, special operations forces are going to play a pivotal role in addressing these challenges. Many may think of U.S. Special Operations Forces for their critical operational successes during the global war on terror over the past 2 decades, including through counterterrorism and direct action missions. And while these missions will remain important, Special Operations Forces also have an important role to play in great power competition. Indeed, the return of great power competition is an opportunity for Special Operations Forces to return to their roots and the core competencies they developed and refined during the Cold War. During that era, Special Operations Forces were one of the U.S. military's key enablers to counter coercion below the threshold of armed conflict, and that is how Special Operations Forces can be applied in the coming years to help the United States and its allies prevail in strategic competition. To discuss these issues today, we're very fortunate to be joined by Assistant Secretary of Defense for Special Operations and Low-Intensity Conflict, Christopher Maier. He will share his insights on how the department has approached the role of Special Operations Forces' role in strategic competition during his tenure. As Assistant Secretary of Defense, he's responsible for all special operations, irregular warfare, counterterrorism, and information operations policy issues on behalf of the Secretary. Assistant Secretary Maier has led a distinguished public service career, having spent many years across the Department of Defense, the National Counterterrorism Center within the Office of the Director of National Intelligence, and the National Security Council. Moderating today's conversation is Kim Dozier, a CNN Global Affairs analyst who covers foreign policy, intelligence, and national security. Previously, she was an intelligence writer for AP and an award-winning CBS News TV correspondent for 17 years. Today's topic will also be used to launch a new Atlantic Council report entitled The Next Decade of Strategic Competition, How the Pentagon Can Use Special Operations Forces to Better Compete. The report, authored by Clementine Starling Daniels and Teresa Luchtenfeld, highlights the roles played by U.S. Special Operations Forces to successfully compete across the spectrum of competition and conflict. Hope you all will read the report. We have hard copies for those of you here in person, and you can also find it online. Convenings like this are central to the Scowcroft Center's mission of developing sustainable, nonpartisan strategies to address the most important security challenges facing the United States and its allies. We also honor General Brent Scowcroft's legacy of service and embody his ethos of nonpartisan commitment to the cause of security, support for U.S. leadership and cooperation with allies and partners, and dedication to the mentorship of the next generation of leaders. Consistent with that mission, the Scowcroft Center's Forward Defense program generates ideas and connects stakeholders in the defense ecosystem to promote an enduring military advantage for the United States, its allies, and partners. It works to identify the defense strategies, capabilities, and resources the United States needs to deter and, if necessary, prevail in future conflict. For our work on Special Operations Forces, the Scowcroft Center cooperates closely with our Atlantic Council's Rafiq Hariri Center and Middle East program. They are leading the way in providing a forum for informing and galvanizing the transatlantic community to shape a stable and prosperous Middle East and North Africa. The Hariri Center's Scowcroft Middle East Security Initiative provides policymakers fresh insights into core U.S. national security interests by leveraging its expertise, networks, and on-the-ground programs to develop unique and holistic assessments on the future of the most pressing strategic, political, and security challenges and opportunities in the Middle East. As many of you in the room are aware, the Scowcroft Middle East Security Initiative launched a counterterrorism project at the end of last year, and the project seeks to provide a disciplined, consistent analysis of terrorism to help stabilize Washington's swings from exaggerating it immediately after a major attack while otherwise neglecting it. This event is public and on the record. We encourage both our in-person and online audience to direct any questions to Assistant Secretary Maier using the askac.org link. Be sure to identify yourself and your affiliation in your questions. We'll be collecting the questions throughout the event, and Kim will pose some of her own questions to Assistant Secretary Maier. We also encourage our online audience to join the conversation on Twitter by following @AC_Scowcroft and using the hashtag #ForDefense. So thank you all very much for joining. I'm very much looking forward to this conversation. And without further ado, I'd like to turn the floor over to our featured speaker.
Thanks, Matt. Appreciate it. Well, good afternoon, everybody. I'll just give you a sense. I'm going to only speak for a few minutes and then move to answer many of your questions. So first off, I would start by saying thank you, Matt, and thank you to the Scowcroft Center and the Atlantic Council. This is a partnership we've had with my team, Special Operations Low Intensity Conflict in the Pentagon, with the Atlantic Council for quite some time, and so very much appreciate Clementine and everybody's support in putting out yet another very high-quality report. What we ask Atlantic Council to do is something that we've been probably generally quietly working on for the balance of my 4 years in this role, almost 4 years in this role, which is trying to look at what the future environment will entail for the global challenges and the global commons, but also then try to think through what the joint force will be engaged in. And then the part that comes back home for us is what is the role of special operations in that? And I think many of you that are keen observers, most of the people in this audience will know that we generally summarize the mission set of special operations in 3 different ways. Counterterrorism, which it's well known for and remains constant focus for us, and I think in some respects, as I've said in a number of occasions, has put even more emphasis on special operations to carry that responsibility as the rest of the joint force rightly adjusts to other adversaries and other challenges. Second is crisis response. This is something that SOF has been involved in for years and years and is often looked to as the primary force, particularly in the U.S. system. And the number of crisis response events has gone up across multiple administrations. Really, as we look back to about the mid-2010s, we've seen a rapid increase in the number of times SOF has been called upon, from military-assisted departures in places like Khartoum to other less traditional instances of helping to support senior leaders get into non-permissive or semi-permissive environments like Ukraine, things like that. And then third, the piece that I hope we'll spend a chunk of our time talking about today is what we often shorthand in our national defense strategy as integrated deterrence, but really the role of SOF in support generally to the joint force in pursuing our objectives against the adversary set that we most focus on, that being China, Russia, North Korea, and Iran. And as Matt said in his remarks, we are seeing increasing alignment along the previous fissures of those groups, which is concerning. So I think as we look at it from a SOF perspective, we've fundamentally changed our approach, where maybe in the global counterterrorism campaigns, we were primarily in the front and the joint force was in support. That has fundamentally changed, and we've spent a lot of time thinking about what that means for us. We're in a supporting role in helping our joint force colleagues to accomplish the objectives that they've been given by the Secretary of Defense and the President. So that puts us much more in the context of being integrated with our fellow services, Army, Navy, Air Force, but also focusing on where our core competencies are and where our comparative advantage is vis-a-vis the joint force, and where we can help to solve some of the most wicked challenges the joint force is confronting. We often shorthand that as helping to fill gaps in the kill chain, or helping to deal with challenges that are fundamental to accomplishing our ends. So with that in mind, I just wanted to briefly address the report that the Atlantic Council did such a good job on. And I think we ask you all as an outside entity to help us see ourselves and help us see what I described at the beginning. What is a future environment likely to look like? Where is there going to be a military role, and therefore the joint force would be involved in it? And then where does special operations play an important role in that accomplishment of those ends, or whatever the strategic environment demands? And so I think being able to see around that corner is where this report helps us. And I think it dovetails very closely with something I'll be prepared to talk about more, which is an operating concept we've done for ourselves that fundamentally says many of the attributes of SOF that have been so called upon over the last decades are still very sound and are the bedrock of how we'll go forward at looking at a future environment, but very much understanding that environment's going to be different. It's going to have adversaries that are frankly a lot more capable and a lot more capable at escalation than the Al-Qaedas and ISISes of the past. We're obviously operating in an environment where surveillance is much more profound, and these adversaries have much greater capabilities in that. So it's going to prompt us to have to operate differently. And we will constantly, I think, see some of our core competencies with allies and partners and those relationships threatened, because many of the adversaries we confront know that we have a distinct advantage. All you have to do is look at the ledger, and there's far more on, if you will, the US side than there is on the PRC or Russia side. And so we fully expect that they will spend a lot of time trying to create fissures and disrupt some of that strength of our alliances. And here is something that SOF, as we talk about with generational relationships, really has a profound competency that it can bring to the joint force. So with that, I would say thanks again to the Atlantic Council for giving us that outside perspective and really helping to drill into certain really insightful lines that I think we will take back and continue to emphasize with our own thinking and our own operational planning. And very much look forward to your questions. And Kim, thanks for doing this. It's a great honor to sit on the stage with you, having seen you for so many years, telling this story and many other stories from places that many people do not want to go because it's of great risk to themselves. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Secretary Maier. Let's dig into who is the audience for this report? Because in some ways, both the Atlantic Council report and General Fenton, the SOCOM Commander's SOF Renaissance report, read like a reminder of the history of SOF, but especially hammering home, we don't just do direct action. So who's forgotten that message?
So I'd say the audience is probably all the major stakeholders. So first and foremost, this is messaging our own force and reminding them that all those things that you said are very much true, that at the end of the day, SOF's mission is going to be the nation's mission. It may have been primarily in a previous context more that direct action, although I would assess that the direct action piece was not all of what SOF does in counterterrorism or was doing, but a reminder that as the nation's adversaries shift, we need to be prepared as a force to shift. And then I think second, to be frank here, it's also to remind the joint force of the role of SOF and the capabilities that SOF brings. It's not the CT force only, it's not the crisis response force only. The DNA of special operations, of course, goes back to primarily what we would now call large-scale combat operations, the OSS in World War II, Vietnam, and supporting much of the conventional force. And so as we build models, and this is how the department spends a lot of time these days because we're not actually engaged in combat with our adversaries, it's models, experimentation, tabletops, making sure that we aren't necessarily white carding or just taking for granted the aspects that SOF would play. And in fact, not only just SOF, but cyberspace, some of our fellow travelers in the global functional capabilities the department has. And then I think also talking to our adversaries and partners at the same time out there, to our adversaries, keeping them aware and hopefully uncomfortable with the fact that SOF has lots of capabilities that they're not seeing but are lurking out there. And then to our partners, we have deep relationships across the SOF enterprise, but also with other parts of their conventional forces too, that at the end of the day becomes, of course, a force multiplier as we think about fighting collectively, because very unlikely the U.S. is going to fight alone.
So since concepts are sometimes hard for people to grasp, let's get specific. If you are going up to talk to appropriators on Capitol Hill, or you are making a presentation to the Secretary of the Army, et cetera, what is the mission that SOF could be doing now that's like 10th Group worked with Ukrainian Special Operations Forces for years, and that was one of the reasons that the Ukrainians were able to repel the Russian attack, especially because Ukrainian special operators had been taught you drop behind the lines, you do ambushes, et cetera. And I remember talking to special operators who worked with them beforehand who said they all originally thought they were supposed to lead all the forces. And we had to tell them, no, you're the guys who melt into the background. Where is a mission right now that in the Crinks fight, China, Russia, Iran, North Korea, where would you deploy SOF if you could just wave a wand and have a pot of money for it?
Yeah, so I think I think back to, maybe the heart of the CT fight when there was a lot of criticism of SOF, you're in 70 countries right now, why are you in all these places? There's only a handful of places we're doing CT work. Now that's very much an asset because we already have the funding and capabilities to be in all those places, 80 plus countries. And so the first order is really creating different options for our policymakers. You cited Ukraine. Ultimately the decision was to remove U.S. forces, but we did have relationships that go back to the end of the Cold War with Ukraine as an example, and that is not unique. That exists in a lot of other places, and oftentimes that is the sort of relationships are built up over really generations. 10th Group's a great example, but also 7th Group, in Latin America, our Navy SEALs operate in a lot of the same places and have those relationships. And I think that becomes an asset also for resilience with our partners. They know we're there. And then increasingly, as we think about potentially a fight where it's semi-permissive or a denied area, we're going to have to rely on those relationships where we may not be proximate anymore. That ability to remotely advise and assist is something that is a feature probably of the environment going forward that certainly we didn't experience in the CT fights.
Well, the Biden administration negotiated temporary deployments to the Philippines now of Marines. Would you like to do an advise and assist mission in Taiwan for if there's a Chinese invasion there and the initial fight is lost, but that doesn't mean the long-term fight is lost? But I mean, do the forces in Taiwan have foreign internal defense guerrilla style skills?
I think it's one of the areas that we're working very closely with them on, and everybody is focused on Ukraine and taking lessons learned. I'm confident people are taking different lessons learned, but one of the things that we certainly would take on board is the importance of having a force that has, as you already highlighted in your example of 10th Group, previous experience working and thinking in ways that are maybe asymmetric or irregular. That is a SOF attribute, and so this is something over quite some time we've been working with Taiwan on in all kinds of different ways, and I think we've been very public in recent years about the series of things we're looking to do to build Taiwan's resilience if there was a PRC invasion. And I think you mentioned the Philippines. Philippines is maybe one of the best examples we cite. Long relationship there on counterterrorism that goes back really since right after 9/11, that we've been able to build into something that's broader, working in close coordination with the Philippines to then put them in a better position to resist some of the PRC aggression in the South China Sea with maritime militias and other things like that. And it's a natural relationship over 25 years of experience working CT that in some cases becomes seamless because the human beings that know each other are now just confronting a different problem together. And herein lies something that's sort of intangible, doesn't always show up on the spreadsheet, but is really, really important to building that resilience of our allies and partners and also creating dilemmas, we think, for our adversaries.
And yet, there remain the rice bowl fights, and especially within DoD when everyone is fighting over budgets and mission sets, because if you can get the mission, then you get the budget, et cetera. How do you sell special operations forces as support forces to the theater commander, et cetera? And how do you transfer if you've got a colonel, a Green Beret colonel in Colombia or a SEAL captain in the Philippines. How do they transfer their knowledge, experience, and relationships to conventional forces? What is the connective tissue? Is it reports? Is it PowerPoints? How does that get across?
Yeah, so I'll kind of give you three answers to what I heard as two questions. First, in terms of the inevitable Rice Bowl fights, I mean, SOF has had a generally flat budget for quite some time, and sure, like everybody else would like a higher top line, but I think ultimately the real trick here is going to be the services continuing to advocate for SOF. We often talk of the SOF truth that all operations require some conventional support. I think in some respects we got to think of it a little bit different, that all conventional operations will probably require some soft support. And if the Secretary of the Army or the Secretary of the Navy or the CNO or the Chief of Staff of the Air Force or whoever comes forward and say, we need to advocate for this soft program, I need this, or this layering of complex different capabilities that SOF has creates an opportunity for my force and gains access to an area I can't otherwise get to, or can do it more cheaply, that's something that we don't even have to advocate for. It's a little bit of by, with, and through the department, right, as we talk about with allies and partners. That's why we talk about this all the time amongst the leaders in SOF. We need to be marbled in with the services. Gone are the days where you can operate as a sort of independent SOF force out there. If you're in naval special warfare, you better be tight with the Navy and the fleet. If you're Air Force special operations, you better know acutely what the Air Force big problems are and try to be solving those as is relevant. That's, I think, the short answer to, if you will, the Rice Bowl or budget piece. I think to your question about how does SOF integrate with the conventional force, or maybe even broader with the rest of the interagency, one way to think about this is, SOF are not diplomats and they're not strategists, but they better have skills as diplomats. They better know how to work as diplomats, because most of these 80 countries I referenced were working out of embassies or in close proximity to the country team, because these are not combat zones. So we're there in support of the ambassador or the U.S. country team, certainly the U.S. objectives. Similarly, not strategists generally, but need to be very strategically minded and understand what the risks are and what the right places are to push and not. And I think understanding that buys a lot of goodwill with the country team and the other people who are going to have different mission sets. Fundamentally, I think sometimes where we have challenges as a Defense Department, and then more specifically to SOF, is we use terminology that can be threatening, particularly environments where we're not involved in combat. So, I've talked in recent weeks about irregular warfare, and that being one of the things that we're very focused on. Well, the very term of warfare spooks a lot of people when you're talking about doing this in a place that might be in Europe or the Indo-Pacific. And so I think at the end of the day, the relationship piece we talk about all the time with partners applies exactly the same way with our fellow American public servants. We need to be able to your example, the Green Beret or the Navy captain needs to be able to articulate in plain English to his counterparts why he's there, the value he brings, and how in the context of the mission of that country team or that region or that combatant command or whatever it is, his role fits in a way that's complementary.
Now, early in the fights in Iraq and Afghanistan, there was a lot of suspicion between conventional and SOF forces. SOF and Intel usually played well, but then the JOCs, the Joint Operation Command, started putting everyone in the same room, and you could start to see, oh, they handle that, they can give me this, and then the war stopped. So you mentioned that one of the things you've done in the past years in the Biden administration is to operationalize this interagency or this joint process. Mm-hmm. Tell us a little bit, how did you do that? Did you recreate the JOC elsewhere?
So it's a great question. So I think not in all cases have the war stopped. So in context, for example, Ukraine, as you brought up, have been a number of cases where I think we've been able to leverage the experience that SOF has in for instance, the Defeat ISIS campaign. And some of the folks that are still in circulation that are very instrumental to some of the strategic things we're doing to advise the Ukrainians, particularly on some of the more sensitive strategic things, deep strike and other things like that, are the same individuals who have grown up and more senior now that would have been dealing with, say, Raqqa or Mosul or Manbij, and have really done what you described, not only taking kind of all the elements of whatever that strike cell required, but understanding the authorities and capabilities of others to be able to integrate that. I think what has become even more important is being able to do that now in a more complex environment with electronic warfare, with cyber, with space aspects that probably wasn't as resident in Syria. But certainly the Syria of recent years has had some of that. That's translated directly, I think, into the force in our support to the Ukrainians. You're right, there's a lot fewer opportunities for individuals to, in the ranks to go out and do this. What we've tried to do is create a degree of artificial sense of urgency in making sure that we're putting people into these situations that weren't even in the force when a lot of this was highly kinetic, and understanding that in many respects our biggest value add is doing some of these same activities in a non-kinetic way. So the cyber and space connection we have in SOF now that's really being integrated, I think, and institutionalized is one of these examples. So making sure that we have operators and those supporting them deeply embedded with our cyber counterparts, with our space counterparts, to understand that where there are points of friction and things that aren't necessarily combat, but definitely competition in those environments, we're understanding those and being able to participate so that when there isn't requirement for us to, say, gain placement and access to use a cyber tool or to gain access to an adversary space capability, we know what that means and are ready to go. And a lot of this has turned into exercises, experimentation, tabletops, war games, these kind of things that, while they may seem artificial, is ultimately how we're making strategic decisions now in the department about what's a winning capability that could survive potentially a contested environment, and what is something that is not, and therefore probably needs to be dispensed with.
I want to start taking questions from the audience. We have one from Mike Hogan. SOCOM has been quick and successful in adopting emerging technologies throughout its history, especially when compared to the DoD at large. He's referring to things like Softworks, I guess. How can these lessons learned be applied across the DoD to improve lagging acquisition processes? Well, that's a little bit unfair in that SOF is smaller and therefore by its nature more agile, but how would you transfer some of those Softworks lessons? Can you tell folks about what that is?
Sure. So I think in a nutshell, where we have been successful in what Mike is asking about is bringing together, as you said, a more nimble acquisition process, not because it has any different authorities, it's just smaller, and we tend to invest in less big acquisition programs, less, if you will, platforms and more capabilities. But really, I think the secret sauce is not even a secret because we talk about it all the time, is really bringing those that are solving the problems, be they operators, be they support folks, into that problem set very early on. So one of the institutional values of Special Operations Command is their acquisition technology logistics shop sits in the headquarters and can get easy access to operators, and we have a conscious effort to do so, which when you start to innovate quickly, as we've seen the Ukrainians do or some of our European colleagues in supporting them, you really start to see the ability to get this special type of innovation that is very responsive to the operating environment. So we've got to find ways to continue to do early adoption as SOF, and then spin off some of those capabilities that have to be done at scale, because we can't do scale, to the joint force, to other parts of the defense industrial base. I would be, though, cautious about how good we tell ourselves that we are, because we're fundamentally built still on, you might say, a hardware model. This is a world of software and rapid innovations that all you have to do is look at the Ukrainians and the Russians and how long things survive operationally to know that we're talking days and weeks, not months and years, that even in the SOF enterprise, even in the CT fight, we operated under. So as much as I appreciate the questioner sort of giving us credit for being faster and more nimble, I think we need to keep the pressure on ourselves because, relative to the Defense Department, maybe, but I think we're still behind where we're going to need to be, particularly if we're confronted with a large-scale combat situation where we're going to have to innovate very, very quickly, particularly if it's a protracted conflict.
Is the breaching suit done yet?
Which version of it? No.
Yeah. Been hearing that about
Yes.
that for many years. Can you name one example, though, of a piece of technology that SOF innovated that's now deployed across conventional forces? Just to put you on the spot.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of examples. One I would highlight that I used earlier that's very relevant is some of the ability to remote and advise and assist, particular when we're talking about our partners who are not in a classified environment, right? They're out on the tactical edge. And I think what we've been able to do is really pathfind in Ukraine with some of that in order to be able to get information and get feedback back from our Ukrainian partners that we're now talking about much more in a scalable program of record for the services and others to use.
Is that basically zooming into the battlefield because you can't have boots on the ground?
I think it's a way to do what we might have called advise and assist in the past with a hand on the shoulder. Now we're doing that through remote means because we aren't physically proximate. Or even if we were in Ukraine, I'm not sure we'd be going to that tactical edge where we're talking about, trench warfare for all intents and purposes. So, but that's one of the examples we see as, really a project of necessity. Again, some of it built on the background of doing this in the CT fights and other places, but something we've been able to improve upon, and then I think the Joint Force has taken steps to adopt.
Got it. New question from Eddie Perucha-Butter, a senior non-resident fellow at the Atlantic Council. ASD Mayor, in your opening comment, you mentioned surveillance as a challenge to the future of SOF. Can you expand on what policy capabilities or prioritization will be required to enable digital force protection or operational security to ensure SOF can execute covert and clandestine activities? Just to dovetail onto that, I was, as you were describing this, talking to folks in the battlefield, I kept wondering, have the Chinese cracked the transmission? So, combining those two,
Sure.
how are we doing keeping the adversary out?
Yeah, and Eddie, I'm going to dime him out a little bit. Knows something about this as a retired Army SOF 06. So, I think the way we think about this big picture is what has fundamentally changed is it's incredibly hard to hide. So it's no longer about hiding, it's more about operating and not being noticed. And that has fundamentally changed some of our policy principles as we go about that. So without going into too much detail that would exceed this conversation, I think this is about figuring out how we can operate in an environment where we know our adversaries are investing huge amounts of money to try to determine what's wheat and what's chaff, and using that to our advantage, but also at the same time understanding that we've got to fundamentally change our mindset about how we think about this from a policy perspective, but also a tactics, techniques, procedure standpoint. And I think it's also prompted conversations that are frankly a bit uncomfortable in some quarters of our government about asking for support from other parts of the interagency for these types of SOF operations that may not be ones that agency or department is comfortable with outside of a kind of a combat situation. So fundamentally, if...
I was going to say, can you give us a hypothetical
Yeah.
example of that?
So fundamentally, if one of the value propositions we bring is access and placement, and as I already articulated, being in a lot of places at the same time and working with partners may require a greater degree of risk. That could be exposure risk, that could be reputational risk. that may be things that we just have to get comfortable with a partner force or even our own fellow interagency colleagues, understanding that we're going to have to operate in these areas that may get us demarched by one of our adversaries or somebody else. And that's a fairly low-level example, but we could see certainly escalation from that. And this is part of what we always talk about. We're only as good as some of the supporting elements or enabling elements that we have, and bringing the interagency along on some of these is part of that.
One of the questions we have is, it's been said that the golden age of SOF is over, and with many joining SOF with the vision of kicking in doors and conducting direct action, so what steps are being, that mission is not the leading mission anymore, except if you're in the ISIS fight, and even then it seems like more of a standoff mission where you're working through partners. So what steps are being done to make sure you're still recruiting top talent when the mission isn't as flashy?
Yeah. It's a very good question. So I would fundamentally reject the notion that the golden age is over, unless the golden age was only about really one or two of our 12 missions, right? Direct action and ultimately here, the actions of our members, I think, are telling. Our retention in SOF is among the highest, if not the highest it's ever been. So those that lived through the, quote, golden age, again, not adopting that term, have decided to stay in for a different fight. And I think for those that might be considering listening to this or thinking about joining special operations from the conventional force, or even a direct accession from, kind of the civilian world, there is no shortage of challenges. And in fact, the mission has become even more, I would call it multi-modular, in the sense that we're looking for people that have expertise in cyberspace, understands seabed and undersea warfare that maybe wasn't in this, quote, golden age, even on anybody's radar screen. Certainly a lot of those capabilities and levels of expertise atrophied. So we become broader, I think, now in looking at where our core competencies are, going back in some respects to our roots. We have a fundamental concept in this operating concept of joint modular formations. So being able to put forward a unit of action in SOF that is able to do a whole series of different activities. We'll, of course, tailor those as necessary, but that gives an individual operator or a member of that team the ability to really draw on a lot of different capabilities. And we're building much greater generalists and specialists at the same time.
So when you say phrases like joint modular force, some people in the room will know what you're talking about, but across the interagency, someone at the State Department, someone at NSA won't know what that means. And surely the 18-year-old coming off the street, though I don't know how many, at the height of the global war on terror, you had a lot of the X-ray programs, things to bring in the youngins who hadn't served prior. But how do you explain that to the man on the street?
Yeah, so
in simpler non-DoD terms.
So joint modular formation, we would think of as a SOF entity that might not only be from one service. It may not be Naval Special Warfare, it may not be Air Force Special Operations Command, it may not be Green Berets from USASOC. It may have those as a core element, but bringing in more of the joint SOF piece that we've often talked about, but we deployed in the past and to present in those individual service components. So you sent a SEAL platoon, or you sent a Green Beret ODA, and often at like that 05 level. What we're talking about is something that would show up purple in as joint as possible, and would bring with it a lot of reach back capability to some of these modular elements that haven't been part of the force in the past. So I've said it a number of times, but the investment we're making in, the Army calls it triad, we call it nexus, but space and cyber as being core parts of our formations that we can reach back on. But it's also about bringing in the intel components and baking that in initially. And some of this is about how we project to the rest of the joint force, and having a standard, if you will, way that we do that is part of the internal business that probably isn't going to attract anybody to join the formation. The bottom line is, though, it's hopefully conveying the idea that at a senior and strategic level, we're talking about how we're going to have formations that can apply to a lot of different problems. Those could be in the Indo-Pacific, those could be in Europe, they could be in different domains. We may have an air-focused one, we may have a maritime-focused one, there could be a ground-focused one, depending on what the problem is. And being even more flexible as we think about this is really the goal. The way I often think about it is, if the core competency of SOF is coming to solve problems and really create dilemmas for our adversary, if we can be joint, which is a tenet of the CT fight, where we've traditionally been joint at a much lower level, if we can institutionalize that and show up at, say a Navy war game with a naval special warfare-led component, but calls on its Air Force counterparts or its Army or Marine Corps or Space Force or Cyber Force counterparts to help with a problem, that's going to be a lot different than probably other parts of the force show up in something that might be a Navy-only war game. So, and as we apply that to the real world, that's going to be something that I think brings a lot more capability and a lot more ability to solve fundamental problems that this nation's going to confront.
And what are the main barriers to rolling that out or keeping that going, since you're at the end of your term?
Yeah, I think fundamentally this is still a concept that we're working on. Some of the barriers are the culture of how we've always done things, which applies even in special operations, but particularly applies in the Defense Department and the interagency. As earlier referenced, people get used to seeing a certain thing, and they extrapolate that thing into the next problem. We've got to be capable enough in demonstrating what this does to be able to show the value proposition very quickly and speak plain English and have our relationships that people are willing to take some degree of maybe risk initially to put something in play and take some patience, strategic patience, to see the value of it. I think it is going to be a culture challenge as well as my example. If, not to pick on the Navy, but if it's a Navy war game and the Navy expects everybody showing up there works for the Department of Navy, and we try to bring in somebody from another part of another service, that's going to be something that's going to take some getting used to, I would say.
Now, there's one other question that's always been close to what I work on, not mentioned in the report, but how resilient are SOF forces right now? Because a long time when I covered troops coming out of Iraq and Afghanistan and other places, Yemen, et cetera, they were being told, oh, go meditate, do your mindfulness, and then you had the old timers saying, no, go get drunk, get in a bar fight, come back to work tomorrow morning. And there was a real tussle. So who won? How resilient is the force?
I sure hope the go get in a bar fight and come back the next morning and do just as well as you did the day before didn't win out. And I don't see that in any sort of consistent manner, which is a good thing. I mean, going back to some of the work that was done starting in 2019 on a comprehensive review, I think helped to highlight some of the challenges that existed in the force. The idea of primacy being given to those that were engaged operationally, sending some of our best leaders forward again and again to do operational assignments, leaving sort of their units behind, understanding that doesn't work particularly well, and being much more deliberate and thoughtful in that. And then I think we have something that we're blessed with in the Special Operations enterprise called Preservation of the Force and Family, that started out as initially putting our operators back together physically, so to speak, and has expanded to have 4 other pillars that focus on social, family, psychological, behavioral, and now increasingly we're focusing on cognitive, not only resilience, but capabilities. So all the things I've talked about are going to require individuals in the soft enterprise to be able to do a lot of things intellectually up here that we're going to need to continue to build too. That has a benefit as well from a resilience standpoint. We still have challenges. Of course, the Las Vegas attack on January 1st of one of our active duty members committing suicide is again, an unfortunate event. Very much grieve for his family and his teammates in that. It's a reminder that we need to stay very much engaged with our forces at that very kind of contact level of leadership. And I know that we spend a lot of time, we do once a quarter with our 06s and above command teams across the soft enterprise, various different focused efforts to look at problems that we know still exist in the force and we're going to have to continue to address, with the expectation that frontline leadership or that next level up leadership is very much acutely focused on those and is exercising invasive leadership that's required.
Well, my last question is, in terms of what you're handing over to whoever your successor might be, looking ahead to the next presidential term, who's the biggest threat? Is it irregular warfare from Iran? Is it China? Is it the unsolved Houthi problem?
Yeah. The challenge probably is unknowable, but I think our experience tells us that the PRC as the pacing challenge, using our current lexicon, and Russia as the acute challenge will persist. But we spend a lot of time on a lot of other challenges. You've already listed those. The Houthis, obviously the Gaza-Israel conflict was one that consumed a lot of time. A lot of concern, as I already mentioned at the beginning, of crisis response. You never know where these things are going to pop up. I don't think anybody was looking at Khartoum as being a flashpoint until it was, for instance, where we had to pull the embassy out. So I think the real challenge is going to be continuing to have that strategic and deliberate focus on building the capability that we know we're going to need to deter these adversaries, namely Russia and China, but understanding there's going to be, some version of the constant, kind of current challenge, be it from someplace in the Middle East, of which there's lots and lots, or is it someplace in, say, Africa that, one of the underlying, drivers of instability contributes to something that we have to deal with from a military perspective. And, the interesting thing is, as you look across all these challenges that I've articulated, they're all Defense Department challenges, but they're also all soft challenges. We're not in an environment where soft, you'll go do these things and the rest of the joint force will do that. I think the Atlantic Council report did a great job of talking about where soft can be a comparative advantage in areas that the joint force isn't as invested. We do that already in places like South America and Southcom AOR and AFRICOM AOR, Central Asia. But we're also involved in these places that are more kind of the pacing challenge operating areas, the Indo-Pacific, Europe. We've already talked a lot about Ukraine and the support there. And then, of course, in the Middle East, be it Iran, be it the ISIS threat, Al-Qaeda threat that's still out there. So it's going to be all those things. I think the big challenge is, where do you find the most important and most effective use of SOF? But in almost all instances, I can't see this as SOF alone. It's going to be SOF in support to the joint force, working with allies and partners to have those outsized effects that we continue to expect of this force.
With that, thank you very much. Thank you for explaining all of that in such detail. I just want to ask everyone in the audience, just sit tight for a moment while you head out. And thanks for educating us on the changes and also educating the audience on things that SOF can do that perhaps they'd forgotten about.
Yes, thanks so much. Very much appreciate your time and the audience's time. Thanks for your interest.
Thank you.